Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you hail from. Thank you for joining in to the Adaptive Cards Community Call, September 2020. Today, it's just me. We're going to do a look at the Q4 roadmap review. So what we're going to do throughout the rest of the year. And sort of a surprise to basically everyone, even those people I work with closely, we've put together this concept called adaptive components, and it was basically published to GitHub yesterday. So unless you really watch our GitHub repo, you have no idea what this is, including people that are deep followers of adaptive cards. So the main thing is to share an early concept with you. It's not entirely developer focused. It's really accrues value to the entire ecosystem. But I figured we'd show it off, see what people think, see if there's any main gotchas, any red flags, and it is a concept that we'll be looking at fleshing out if we kind of we see there's some momentum behind it. So that is a look at what we're going to do today. I do want to mention, so the Microsoft Ignite conference is coming up September 22nd through the 24th. There will be a adaptive cards session in there. I think the catalog is live, so if you register, you should be able to see the full catalog. There's at least one, possibly two adaptive cards focus sessions. Won't be me, so I might get to see it just for the first time, like everyone else. Some pretty cool stuff, though. A lot of evolution since what you may have seen at Build. So definitely check that out. It's free to everybody. Obviously, like all virtual like things are in 2020. So do check out that Ignite conference. So we're going to jump right in. I really only have 2 slides. The rest are just kind of resource links. So let's look at the Q4 roadmap review. So we do this a little bit every month. It's had quite a bit of an update since last month. So if you want to follow along at home, you go to aka.ms/AC roadmap, and I think the AC and R have to be capitalized. And I've basically changed it into 3 sections, so you have a better idea on what are we considering, what's actually planned, and what's launched. So this is all a completely new look of this possibly familiar thing if you'd seen some of this. So I'll walk through the quick things. So the first is under consideration. These are things that we have heard are important, some more so than others. You'll see this little counter here showing that's how many of you folks that join the community calls, folks internally here at Microsoft have told us how important a given feature is to them. So a table element with a concept of rows comes up all the time. It's very high on our list of things that are under consideration. You can sort of achieve it today with column set and columns, but if you truly have tabular data, it's a little bit clumsy. So a lot of things like that, like table, some other pretty popular ones, thumbs up, thumbs down control, some custom colors for text and container backgrounds. This is a particular one that we want to make sure that accessibility contrast requirements are met. So if we do allow custom colors in the future beyond what we have today, you will be required to provide a hex value for the background as well as the foreground, so that we make sure contrast requirements are met. So we still want to make sure we're meeting our accessibility obligations while still giving people a little more flexibility. So that one comes up a lot. Probably the biggest one after input validation, which we released last month, is this concept of client-side updating. So really neat stuff is possible here. You can imagine cascading dropdowns. You can imagine just the UI changing in just really powerful ways. So that one comes up a lot. We'll have more to share on that coming soon. File attachment or an upload control comes up all the time. SVG and charting comes up all the time. So these are all things that are under consideration, not currently planned, but your opportunities to come here, click on this, tell us what you need, how important, nice to have, important or critical. And all you have to do is provide an email address and why you need this. You don't have to create an account. You don't have to create a password. It goes directly to me and the team within Microsoft. So if you're using adaptive cards for an internal proprietary project, this doesn't get posted publicly, but it does. It's a very powerful way for you to influence what we go and build next. So checkout under consideration, that's probably the least exciting because it's like, well, when will that ever happen? We don't know that. The next step is obviously planned. And so we do have some updates here. These are all things planned for our next major schema release. The animations aren't quite up to snuff, and I'll just kind of have to explain them quickly. Hopefully they'll make sense. The first is password masking on text inputs. So this would be a new text style where you can say this is a password and it'll just kind of mask the input. Very, very popular request. We're going to go ahead and nail that one. Accessibility is coming in. I'm going to skip over autocomplete because it's coming, but like later than some of the other ones. So I'm going to handle the ones that I know are coming in somewhat sooner rather than later. This comp's a little weird, but what this is showing, again, a very common request in a lot of cards that have a lot of actions. So the best adaptive cards are actionable, but sometimes you just can't fit all the buttons in, or it just looks a little clumsy having all the buttons lined up. So what this will let you do is overflow actions into a kind of ... flyout menu. So the actions the card will just show the ... but the actions themselves will be hidden behind a flyout or a pop-up, if you will, or a menu. So that one we're going to make traction on. That is planned. We're actively speccing that out. You can actually follow along with that spec and comment on that one from here. This one's interesting. So we're evolving choice set to allow a filtering UX. So if you've got a choice set with hundreds of items, right now you just get a full drop-down list and you get the experience out of the box that a drop-down list offers, but you can't start typing and have it filter. You can see in this comp, I've typed INT, and so the list is filtering it down to things that match that. And we'll support things like starts with or contains, and basically just add a filtering UX to a choice set, basically by adding this new style property to choice set. Keep in mind, and why I kind of skipped over this autocomplete, we're separating these two in this is really about filtering a static list of choices. That one's a little easier for us to figure out. The dynamic autocomplete, as in autocompleting addresses or usernames where you have a server-side communication, that one's a little trickier. That's some new ground for adaptive cards. So we're still working through how best to deliver that one. But the static filtering will hopefully help a lot of people who just have, 100 items sent down in the choice set and just want a better filtering UX. Also in that, we are adding the ability to provide an action when a choice is selected. So maybe you have a card, very common in Teams task modules, those little modal dialogues where I've got a choice set at the top. Maybe it's select a project or select something, and you want the selection of that choice set to invoke an action to basically refresh the card or present a new set of things. So this will be a way for you to describe an action to execute when a choice is selected without the user having to like pick from a dropdown and then press a button. It's just a little shortcut for executing that type of stuff. We're also adding better tooltip support, and this is probably the worst comp. I blew up one of the most pixelated screenshots. I've asked them for a more high-res one, but what you're going to see here is some people have used action icons. There's two ways to make an action as an icon. You can use an action set and set the icon URL, or you can use a container with like a select action or an image with a select action, which is what this is. And so you can see, hopefully possibly see as I've blown this up, if I mouse over this icon, I really have no idea what that's going to do until I click on it. And so what we're going to do is automatically use the title for the tooltip in this case. So you still want an icon. You want the title property to be, hidden behind a user action. It's not a primary thing, but we'll still make it appear as the tooltip. The final thing in the rendering world is going to be adding an is-enabled property to the actions. And this is really just purely a UX thing. This is going to help, a lot of cards, maybe they've got like 3 actions in them, and they're kind of mutually exclusive. You can either delete something or archive it, maybe. So once you delete it or archive it, you can refresh the card with its updated state. And if you can't do that action again, you just remove the button. But that you sort of lose like, well, what did I just click on? What has happened? So this scenario lets you refresh the card with the same content, except maybe the delete button is just disabled. And it just gives the user a little better understanding of, oh, okay, that's something took place. The button's still there. I can no longer click on it, but at least I have some understanding of what action had just happened. So that's a look at a lot of minor, like, fit and finish, I guess I would say a lot of these features are. These have been really common asked primarily from a lot of our Teams developers who are really pushing the bounds of what you can do within Teams. So hopefully those will go a long way, just to adding a lot of just fit and finish, nice to have. A lot of big stuff coming too, though. So templating exists on .NET and JavaScript, Node.js, so you can apply templating in the back end. Our long-term vision, and you'll see some of this when I talk about components here in a little bit, our long-term vision is that the templating stuff happens on the client. You can just send data. Teams does the data binding. That opens up a whole world of client-side interactivity. It opens up a whole new world of live data binding, so when the data changes. But the precursor to all of that, where we want all this to go, is having the templating engine available on every adaptive card platform. So we need the templating engine to work on iOS. We need to work on Android. We need to work in Python. We need to work in Java. So we're working on the mobile SDKs right now. And ideally, hopefully, I don't know if any of my devs are on the call, but we're really hopeful that we'll have those done by the end of the year. And that is when 2020 opens up a whole host of possibilities beyond kind of the static one-way rendering that the templating that we have today. For ecosystem and integrations, we've got this universal action model we've talked about a little bit. We went into a little bit of a deep dive on it at Build. We'll cover it even more in detail at Ignite, so definitely check out that Ignite session. But really what this is a standard way for handling actions and refreshing cards within the ecosystem. If you happen to be a Microsoft 365 developer on the call and you're writing cards for Teams and Outlook, there's two very different models for handling actions for bots versus Outlook. So we're standardizing that on a universal action model. We'll have a pretty cool demo to walk through at Ignite. And that's the current plan. I think we'll have that done by the end of the year. The SDK support will come a little bit, but you should be able to start taking advantage of that stuff somewhat soon. And we hope that'll go a long way towards making cards truly universal, truly portable, including the action handling. Incidentally, action handling, which you can imagine requires an authenticated, trusted call to a backend. There is a tight contract between, can I trust that this action is being invoked by the user within a legit Teams client, within a legit Outlook client. Having that transport and that ability to fetch, to submit actions also means we can pull data from that backend. And that's where we think we can tap into this model and deliver the dynamic autocomplete scenario where the web API can complete the request because now we'll actually have a way to make authenticated calls to a REST API. So a lot of exciting stuff happening there as we start to standardize and flesh out a communication model to go along with the rendering model of adaptive cards. Power Automate connector for the template service. Man, we've been trying to land this for a while. It is planned. I don't know if I can commit to a deadline just yet, but hopefully we'll have some stuff to share in there soon. Adaptive cards and Power Virtual Agents. If you're interested in Power Virtual Agents, we will have a lot to share. I think in January is when the next major announcement from that team comes about. If you do happen to be, I'll just add this quick segue to get people interested. If you are a Power Platform user on the call today, we are setting up a Power Platform focused focus group in the next month, somewhere around October, early October. So I'll have a slide for that, but I just want to queue it up. If you are interested in that, stick around. And we'll have an opportunity for you to say, hey, I'd like to participate in that. We'd really like to understand how the platform can better be integrated with adaptive cards. And a focus group is one way for you to give us really deep kind of one-on-one input. And the last thing is card author services, or the CMS. It is planned. We don't have it figured out how the heck we're going to deliver this thing. We're really trying. We totally see the value in it. Just trying to massage it with our other commitments. So that's a look at everything planned. It's a lot of stuff. a lot of it is laying the groundwork for a pretty exciting 2021, particularly templating everywhere and the universal action model. A quick look at launch. Some nice things were added to the designer. We have a copy bound card button to the designer. I don't know how many people this will particularly help, but it's in some cases it's a nice addition. So to give you an idea of what that is, and just to kind of get you in the habit of join these calls, please, by all means, we'll tell you what launched. But if you'd like to learn offline, this new launch section will be much easier to see, what launched when, and just a little bit of offline way of seeing things. But to give you an example, so here we've got a template, which, as a quick refresher, a template is just an adaptive card which has these binding expressions. So the data comes separately. And I can click preview mode and see what this card looks like with some sample data. This is just a design time experience. So I can say hello world or hello community call. And you can see the card is updating as we do that. But sometimes I want this fully data bound card, not just the template. So I can go down here and copy this, but that's going to give you the template. Like this button now, copy card payload, and the tooltip explains that. This actually copies the card as you're seeing it in this designer. And that can be useful for a handful of things, storing the fully rendered card somewhere, maybe checking how this card looks like in UWP or iOS. So basically that's just a little enhancement that we added to the designer that you can get started with today. And the last thing is obviously like input validation and evolution. Tons of really cool stuff. We have some new samples on adaptivecards.io that shows some really neat wizard-like things you can create, where you can collect subsets of information. I can click submit, notice validation fired as appropriate. We are still working on when this will roll out to Teams and Outlook and all of our partners. So stay tuned. Validation, huge update. We're really excited about it. And we're just kind of making sure Teams has everything they need to get this rolled out to folks that can start taking advantage of it. Okay, I haven't really been looking at chat. Actually, it looks just like a couple smiley faces, so that's totally good. I'm going to say this right off the bat if this is your first time. So I like to keep these calls pretty casual, and feel free to ask questions as we go. We've got people on the call to help you asynchronously in the chat, so don't wait to the dedicated Q&A if you don't want to. We will have a Q&A after this. But if you have any questions on the roadmap, any feedback, your best way is to go to aka.ms/AC roadmap and just tell us which of these things are most important to you, and make sure that, if it's really important to you, that it moves from this under consideration over to planned, especially as we wrap out the Q4 quarter and head into 2021. Feels like forever away. It'll be here before we know it. It's been a weird year. Let's get into a new one. With that, I'm going to switch gears completely and talk about something that is just really an idea that we think will solve a lot of problems and is really finally something that's possible. So follow along, if you will. This is public on our GitHub. One of my favorite things about these community calls is we get to talk about this stuff as it's baking. And so what this really is a concept that enables the creation of higher level components powered by templating and native adaptive card elements. So again, this is a draft. We don't have a plan to ship this, but we do have some pretty big internal demand on making this real. And I think it's got a decent chance to become a real thing, possibly sooner rather than later, actually. So I won't go through the full spec, but I will go through the highlights and some examples and really open the floor to you folks to ask questions, clarify things, voice concerns, because it is a mash of a whole bunch of things. So the overall objective is to allow anyone, developers, designers, Power Platform folks, citizen developers, to define, use, and share higher level component abstractions with the general public, or within their organization. And before I even go further, I want to clarify some terms there. What do we mean by a component abstraction? Let me go to this first example. And again, you'll notice a lot of my comps are just super blurry. Hopefully you can kind of make this out, but what I'll describe here is, here we've got an adaptive card. It's got a text block that says new proposal. It says John has been waiting long, so a text block here. And then you see this thing. We call this a file chiclet. And this is a little preview of a file. So you can see a mix of adaptive card elements, such as text and images, but also a component is the term we're using, called a file. Another example might be a thing. And a thing is just anything that has an image, a name, a description. And I just want to say, hey, in my adaptive card, I want to put a thing here, and here's its name, description, image. And that may expand into the UI that you see here. And the file chiclet may expand out into this UI. So just to clarify some terms, that's what we mean by these higher level components. What I mean is something beyond just the native adaptive card elements like text blocks, images. They're almost like these semantic components. Like I want to preview, a file or a person or a meeting, and I just want to provide the data. I don't want to lay out the thing. I just want to say, here's the data, here's the semantic thing. And so how can we come up with a world where we can define, use, and share those across the ecosystem? So that's the number one objective. Number two is that we really want to make sure, if this becomes a thing, that we really nail the tooling integration. So component authoring should be a first-class experience in a designer. Components should be composable, used anywhere in the card body, and chained together as necessary. Components need to be responsive. So if you can author components like files, well, adaptive cards hosts can vary pretty wildly. You can be looking at a card on a mobile screen versus on a desktop where you have a lot more real estate, or an app like Teams versus Outlook versus Cisco WebEx that may have different considerations. So a component needs to be able to fully adapt to those different things. We want to make sure a component author can fully support the full ecosystem. This is where it gets exciting, this concept of local and remote component registries. So I'm not going to get into that just yet, because I think walking through the examples will maybe make this a little more understandable. And then the final piece, which is currently marked as a P2, is components should be actionable. That's got a lot to figure out. So I don't think it'll make the initial MVP if it becomes a thing. But to get the idea of the scenarios, you can imagine this file chiclet here. Well, here's that ... menu we talked about during the roadmap review, where I can put some actions on this file. Obviously, depending on my permissions, I can do things to files. I can delete them, archive them, share them. And so what's a world look like if this component, this file component, also had actions associated with it? So how do we figure that out? Okay, lots of open issues I just reviewed this with the team yesterday. So you are getting the next day access to a lot of stuff. So I want to go through the open issues. But the goal, by the way, with sharing this with you is tell us if there are some open issues. We've got a couple already in the works, like how do we fetch authenticated images? How does a component potentially fetch remote data? But I won't get so far into those details, but those are the types of things that we're hoping you can, challenge us to think through these things and think, how would this work, if it became a reality? So let's jump into some examples. First one, we talked about a little bit, this file chiclet. And this is somewhere in my card, I want to represent a file. And so the way it would work as a card author, as you writing the card, you would say, here's my type. I'll make it a little bigger. And my type is a component.file. So just like we have action.submit, we have input.something, the naming convention would be similar. And this is just component dot and then the name. Then you just pass in the metadata for that component, such as what's the title, what's the file type, what's the object URL. And with that data, the card that gets rendered would look like this. If you wanted to achieve this today, you're a current user of adaptive cards, you can probably, see the code in the matrix. You can kind of see what might be happening here. This is a column set. First column has an image, second column has 2 text blocks, and the third column has like an action set with this ... That's exactly what we want to happen. This component gets expanded into those adaptive card elements. So let's say I want to define, now I'm someone else maybe in my org not using the component, but I'm defining the component. I'm describing its metadata and how it works. It would look something like this. The type is an adaptive component. The component name is file. That's how it matches up. So you can imagine this is the other side of the usage coin. A component should describe its schema. What are the properties that are required? So as you can see, I'm passing in title, file type. Obviously, others here were omitted for brevity. It can also explain what is required of that component. We can do some validation there. We can do some really nice tooling integration that if you type in, component.file, ideally with this information, we can give you full IntelliSense for components. And that's going to be pretty helpful, especially if this ecosystem gets popular and we end up having dozens or hundreds of components for all sorts of things. So then we get into, once you defined your schema, the next step is to define the views. And for simplicity, I'm just going to say there's only one default view. And this is where exactly that expansion happens. So this thing is going to view into a column set. The first column is 35 pixels. It's got images in it. And here's, just again, a kind of primitive or naive look at what this might look like. So this image is going to show when, using our templating $when, the file type equals docx, then it's going to show the word logo. If the file type, again, the card author is specifying the file type. So you can see the component is binding to the data that was passed in. And in that case, this image would be shown. If it's XLS, we will show an Excel logo. And again, this is kind of primitive and a naive attempt, but hopefully you're just getting the idea of components. Then we got second column binds to the title, the URL, et cetera, and it formats it. And basically now I've been able to say, hey, here's my component, and it would get expanded and rendered into this. That is, in a gist, the concept of components. If you're still following along, or at least mostly following, I'll get into some of the nuances here. So another quick example is things. And I chose the term things because if you follow schema.org, which has been a standardized way of describing just about everything, it's a partnership with Google, Microsoft, any search engine. Now, when you search for people, you always see all that metadata in the sidebar. If I search for like Satya Nadella, it's like CEO of Microsoft, and it's got all that data. That's no longer populated by scraping the web. Now it's populated by these metadata tags that are all over the web, the schema.org things. And at the base of all of them is a thing. And a thing is just something that has a name, description, an image. It's got some actions, what's the subject of, and this thing, schema.org is all encompassing. I mean, you can talk about like a convenience store, which inherits from store, which inherits from local business, which inherits from place, which inherits from things. So it's a very complex way of describing things. I think that's got a lot of potential for this component model. When you imagine a very common scenario where I just want to display a bunch of things and they have an image, a name, and a description. So in this case, I'm just saying, here's my thing. It's the Golden Gate Bridge. Here's its description. Here's its image. And you can imagine the way I define a thing is I describe its schema and I describe its views. That's not super exciting. Yeah, it saves me from having to do this. But if you keep following along, you can see some of the power that gets into this. So more examples that I'll put together, but hopefully the idea is making sense. Composition is going to be really important. So let's say I have a card that, someone asks, what are the three most famous bridges in the United States? Well, actually, that's a stupid one because the London Bridge is in there. What are the three most famous bridges? And so the card that gets returned is a text block that says, here are the three most famous bridges, and then a column set, and each one of those columns is a thing. So I really want to stress that it's got almost unlimited configuration of using native adaptive card elements combined with these components to really create a lot of really interesting ways, and adding a little more semantic understanding to the card itself. Tim, I see you have your hand up. How can I assist you?
Yeah, just when I see that, I'm wondering, is that fully supposed to work with templating and data binding? So can I have like data bind to components?
Yes, the current requirement for a component is that it relies on templating and expressions. So anything you can do in a template, a component is going to be purely declarative. It has to exist in this JSON file. So if you have a really advanced one that maybe needs to write some code or fetch some data or do something more advanced, that's currently not in scope and probably won't be in scope for this. So let me get into some more of the sort of exciting stuff and where we see this a lot of potential here. So if you're still following along, let me paint a picture here. Just like Tim sort of asked, what can I do in a component? Can I use templating and data binding? A component definition is this JSON file. The entire thing is in a single JSON file. You can do some advanced stuff if you followed along with templating. If you haven't, I'll give a quick update. The stock update card is a good one to do or to show you. In templating, you can bind to properties. That's just $curly brace, and then you bind to the data. So here we've got the pure data, and here you've got the template. But you can do some advanced stuff. So for example, you can write expressions, you can do loops, you can write functions like formatting. So this is showing a lot of interesting stuff here. So the data is 128.9, but when I present it to the user, I want to make sure, because it's a currency, it rounds to 2 decimal places. So I can call this function very much like Excel functions or Power Automate expressions. You can say format number, change, and then I pass in how many decimal places I want to round to. I can also write an expression here, whereas if the change, as in the stock, is up, greater than 0, I want this up arrow, otherwise I want this down arrow. I can also apply that to color here, so you can see this is green or good because the change is up, but if it's down, it shows as red. So this is showing the power of taking these expressions, these purely declarative expressions, the data binding, and taking it to a deeper level, basically by adding some semantics around resolving them. So if you're still following along, let me paint a picture on how this would work. So how does a thing get registered, or how does a file get registered? Like I said, the whole point on this is people can define, share, and use these components. So how does that work? The current theory is that there would be 2 ways. A host will have a local component registry. So Teams might register some components that says, hey, in Teams, here's what works. Or realistically, like let's say M365 apps have a set of components that make total sense for office-based things. So there might be a file component and a meeting component and a person component. And they would register these for M365 like locally in that app. There also may be a world where we have a remote component registry. And these are built on the concept of the public template service we've talked about for a while. It's been a proof of concept, but here's how that would work. So the renderer is trying to render things. It's like, oh, a text block. Well, I know how to render text blocks. Perfect. Then it encounters a column set. It's like, well, I know how to render column sets. And then it gets to do a column, and I know how to render those. And then it gets to something called component dot. And it's like, oh, okay, component dot thing. I don't know what that is. So what would the renderer, what would the client do? In this case, if the host opts into remote component registries, it would make an HTTP call to something like templates.adaptivecards.io/components/component name. So in this case, it would be component/thing.json. And that request would serve up that entire component definition. So just like I showed you some more advanced examples here, we can just put those in a Git repository, put those somewhere where they're just statically served up. We can fetch it down. And effectively what happened is the client just learned a completely new way to render something in a safe way. Because it's purely declarative, you can basically do what templating and expressions has. You can't really run a custom code. There are definitely some security concerns that we are working through. But I think this is a really neat potential for really creating these dynamically generated. I mean, anyone could create a new component for, I'm having a hard time looking around. I'm like, what the heck are things that I might want to run a component for? Basically, you would just have to add them to this GitHub repository, serve this up, and then Teams would know how to learn a different component automatically. And I think there's a lot of really neat potential there. I see a question on handling versioning. So Thing v1, 3v12. Perfect question. I will get to it in a moment. Right before I get to that, though, I want to talk about the next level of support here. Tim, yeah, do you want to ask a quick question?
Yeah, no, I just want to say, you were searching for an example, though probably the thing you have on every card with the person picture and the name or something, you see that on literally every card. So that's probably a good example.
Yeah, a concept of a persona. I mean, you see it everywhere. Even in this comp here, you've got this requested by. We can do some really cool things with personas. Totally agree. So okay, let's get into some more of the cool stuff. So multiple layouts. So in many cases, a single layout may not suffice for a given component. For example, even in a thing, you may want, this sort of hero view, which I think it's typically called, or a thumbnail view, or maybe a stack view. So it's the same data, it's the same image, name, description with different layouts. So the current theory is that view can have the ultimate view that gets determined for a component would be determined by multiple factors. One would be implicitly. So we would find the best view based on the render version. This was Hilton's question right here. So there may be very much a 1.0 thing and a 2.0 thing that maybe takes advantage of new elements that we added, like media or something. So we definitely want to support a component being fully compatible across renderer versions and across schema versions. We also want the view to be looked up based on display constraints. So we may have a, if there's a height constraint on the card, we would want to pick this thumbnail version. Or if you're putting these components in a list, we would probably want to pick a more compact version. So that would be an automatically selected one based on display constraints. Probably some others there implicitly, but those are the two that come off right off top of mind. We want to grab the most appropriate view based on the supported version and the display constraints. There's also an explicit way that a card author might want to select a component, and that's by name. And so the working theory here would be, in addition to component.name, there would be a reserved property called view, and that would be a string array. So if we apply that to our thing, it becomes, okay, here's my card, I want a thing, here's its data, Golden Gate Bridge, blah, blah, blah. And the view I want is an array, and it's first in wins, so I want either my hero view or the thumbnail, whichever matches first. And so why would a match not be found? Or why do we need this to be an array? Like, shouldn't the component just say, here's what I support, and that's what it is, and then the card author looks that up and they do their due diligence? Well, a really key thing we want to figure out is components are composable, and these registries are modifiable. They're mutable. And what I mean by that is, let's say Teams wants a custom version of the file component. And so what they do is maybe they have their own registry, either in the local registry, or they swap out a team-specific remote registry. They may add or remove or modify a particular view. So we want the same card to be forward and backward compatible for different apps between different things. So that's the current plan on like where you would say, I want the most appropriate view for me. And if none of those match, every component should possibly will require this, should have a default view, and that would be the ultimate one that gets rendered. This is the specifics to get into like Hilton's question there, like what about how would we actually handle versioning? So in version 1.2 of Adaptive Cards, we introduced this concept of a fallback. And fallback works today where I can say, to render this container, I require version 1.6. Otherwise, I'm going to fall back to something else like another container or a text block. And that works today with, say, the media element. So the media element currently doesn't exist in Teams. We're working on getting that added. But if you want to write a card that works in Teams and some app that does support media, you can still write a single card. You would have, here's your media element, and then you would write a fallback, and you would maybe fall back to an image that shows the poster and maybe has like a select action. So when you tap on it, it plays the video instead of getting it in line. But that requires concept and that fallback concept already exists. And so we can use that same concept in our component authoring to make a component basically forward and backwards compatible with different versions. Lastly, we want to make sure there's rich designer integration. I'll really only talk a little bit to this because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. Hopefully I didn't, lose everybody in this. But the designer is going to be really important to nailing this all the way from authoring a component that has multiple views over the data, like that thing component, but also maybe connecting to a remote component registry. So if I'm designing a card in Teams, and Teams has said, here's the Teams component registry, I should be able to design a card that uses those components, that does the same behavior. It fetches the component, renders it in a design time experience using my sample data. So we really want to make sure we nail the design time integration. And that's really the last piece. I already talked about this, but this just gets into the little details of a component will clearly outline the schema that it expects. And that enables us to do a whole bunch of things for validation, for autocomplete, IntelliSense, designer integration, so that when you reference a component, we can automatically build up the property sheet, do a lot of nice stuff as long as they do that. And the last thing I'll add is there's some really neat explorations we can do. I mentioned the schema.org stuff and its hierarchy. So if I go to schema.org and I see this is a local business, which inherits from organization, which inherits from thing, it also has a place. Well, if I'm using a local business, maybe there's not a local business component, but there is a thing component. So could we have a way to kind of traverse that hierarchy to find the most appropriate component? And there's just this, again, it's just an early exploration, but it would, I think, go a long way to making this more user-friendly, especially in a complicated model such as schema.org, which there's thousands of different data types, and templating all of them doesn't make sense. If you can target one of the types in the hierarchy, you can at least get a pretty good representation. And to give that an example, like, so local business, what it adds beyond name, description, and address, it adds things like opening hours. Well, if it finds the thing component, the thing's not going to render opening hours, but at least you won't get a full loss of the data. So that was a look at this component concept. Any thoughts immediately on that? Yeah, I'll just kind of take it. I'll switch through it. A couple questions as I go through. So the recording and the blog post goes up for these calls usually within about a week. I'd say end of next week. I have to turn this into a blog post, and sometimes I'm a slacker. But hopefully it'll be up by next week. That actually leads me into real quick. So queue up questions if you have them. We can feel free to unmute. I love doing these community calls. I want to make sure you're getting value out of the community calls. So I would love it if you take this survey. I think these are really important for us. It shouldn't take more than 3 minutes. It's that's a big paste. There's a link there. Just a couple questions. I called this out. We are looking to do a focus group on Power Platform. So email me, matt.heidinger@microsoft.com, if you'd be interested in joining a future focus group or our technology adoption preview program. Resources, let us know what features you need. Definitely use that roadmap I showed earlier. Get started with templating now. You can look at the adaptive card source code. The Build 2020 session goes into a bunch of stuff. One of our fan community websites that really help people get with the build adaptive cards is madewithcards.io. Check out these other community calls, especially if you're a Microsoft 365 developer. And then I'll switch to this slide real quick. So this is where the recordings go, ak.ms/m365dev YouTube. I'll leave that there. The next call, join us October 8th for the next call. And with that, I'll just kind of switch it over to Q&A. If people have any thoughts on anything, it doesn't have to be on the component stuff or the roadmap. Just let me know what you guys think. See a question on supporting universal dialogues and modals. That's an interesting one. If you feel comfortable unmuting, if you're still on the call, Pawan, maybe or add a follow-up, like what you mean by that.
Yeah. So what I mean by that is right now, if you see and if you look at Teams has a component called task component, which is a modal or a
Yep.
dialogue, right? But
Yep.
each platform will have its own way of doing dialogues and stuff. So what I'm trying to get here is if we can build something like how you have a universal action, how we can trigger a universal dialogue on or a modal on a button click, or say for and load some components into that, right? It can be an iframe, it can be adaptive card, which is inside the modal. The place where it really helps is that if you have a form and you want to capture information, it would be much easier to have a single focus point on allowing the customer to input data rather than looking
Yeah.
at in terms of a message stream, right? So that's where
Yeah.
that becomes really helpful rather than overpopulating your message stream and people lose focus on the new messages and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm looking at and that.
That makes total sense, actually. And yeah, you're right. We can achieve the same thing in Teams, but not universally. What I'd love to learn more about, that was a perfectly good summary. If you have not submitted things to the roadmap, I follow this really closely. If you just go to the submit an idea, because that one currently isn't in there, just describe a little bit of what you just said to me,
Okay.
and that'll make it'll definitely put it on the stack. So we'll talk about it as we start to prioritize new things, because that is a good call out, especially with forms dense cards.
Yeah. I think I have one, but it might not be named like that. So let me go back and see in
Okay,
the list. I had created something a few weeks ago, a week or two ago. So, but I will
sure.
go back and check. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I do have one more question. I don't know
Sure.
whether this is the right forum, but I will let you decide on that. I wanted to see if you have, like, say, for example, any questions, like, say, about if you have, like, say, we are a chat platform. So I work at Ring Central, and we are trying to adopt adaptive cards. So as part of that, one thing which we're trying to do is that, as you know, a chat platform is very message dense, and if you
Mm-hmm.
move from one team to the other, right, especially in Teams, right, you would have to re-render the cards, right? And especially if you have like 10 or 15 cards in that team, right?
Yeah.
Is there any benchmarking done on what would be the, like, say, for example, the smooth scrolling functionality? Because each card takes some time. The more complex it is, the more time
Yeah.
it takes to render, right? So is there any kind of performance benchmarking done or something like that, so that we can use that? Because one thing we are seeing is that, at least in our platform, there is some frames per second we have lost some. So I don't know
Sure.
whether it is our side or in your side. So if I have some benchmarking, then I can go and have, like, look with the team to figure out that is to see where we can optimize it, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. I would say our performance benchmarking is a little sporadic. We have different support on different platforms, some better than others. I remember seeing something about Ring Central. If you would, I can't remember if we have an email thread or not, but if you want to kick off a mail to me, we could certainly dive into that, especially if you're hitting some performance concerns. We want to at least start with those and see what we can help you with. So if you just want to shoot me an email, it's right in the chat, or if we already have a thread, ping me and accept my apologies if if I'm behind on replies. I'm a little behind on email right now.
no worries at all. No worries. I'll send it out, Gates. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Luis asked, will there be new stuff regarding Apple cards at Ignite? It'll be worth going to the session for sure. We're not going to attending the session. There has been a lot of refinements around what we talked about at Build. I wouldn't expect any like completely net new examples. Maybe though. Trying to think. It's hard for us to, like, show like crazy new stuff, because I share stuff with you as it's baking every month. So we usually don't have big announcements or big releases at these conferences. I try to reserve those for you fine folks every month. But I would say it's going to be run by our partners in Teams and Outlook, and so you'll get a good look from their perspective on how to put together a lot of the things that I've been talking about. So definitely check out the Ignite stuff. Any other questions? I don't think I missed anything. Oh, David. So said schema.org def has 4 fields that you can use Schema.org definition has 4 fields that you can use as there. Do you need to define them? I'm not sure I'm following that. As in, if schema.org has already defined those, do you have to redefine them? Maybe that's what you're asking. And feel free to unmute or clarify that. The hope would certainly be that we don't have to require duplication. Given schema.org is clearly using JSON schemas all over the place, it would be great if we could somehow scan that repo and build up the component schemas and bootstrap a lot of the schema.org stuff. So hopefully we don't have to duplicate the work that they've already done to define the schema part. Cool. Well, if there are no questions, I'll just plug this survey one more time. Again, it does help us keep things moving with these things, making sure we're giving you the best info we can, showing you the content we can. I will go ahead and leave it where we're at. I appreciate everyone joining in, and stay tuned for Ignite, and then we will see you in October, second Thursday of every month. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Matt. Bye.
Bye-bye.